So, my name is Victoria Chavez. I was interning at Computer Science for Rhode Island, and my supervisor was Holly Walsh, or is Holly Walsh. My research project was around broadening participation in computing, increasing accessibility for students with disabilities. Oh, there's a clicker. Okay. So, I want to start with a couple of definitions. Can people hear me without the microphone? Okay, beautiful. So I want to start with a couple of definitions, just so that everyone's on the same page.
We are recording it, so you might still need to use it.
Okay, all right, I'll stay here then. Okay, so I'm not going to read all of them out loud to you because I assume you can all read. But I do want to cover disabilities because I use the term disabilities very broadly, and it does cover both cognitive and physical disabilities. And so that is something that I will go into later, but just keeping in mind the different kinds of disabilities and what they would be categorized under. So learning disabilities, autism, and intellectual disabilities would fall under cognitive disabilities, and disabilities such as blindness, deafness, mobility disparity limitations would fall under physical disabilities. I also want to cover a little bit universal design for learning. This is somewhat of a newer topic. It's based off of the idea of universal design. So if you think of things like sliding doors and curb cuts, the idea for them is to make things accessible for users of wheelchairs, but they're beneficial for all of us, right? So if we're carrying a bunch of grocery bags and the doors automatically open, great, we don't have to push a button for the door to open. And so the universal design for learning is taking that idea and applying it in an educational context. And then assistive technologies is just products, equipment, and systems that enhance learning for folks with disabilities. Great, so what is Computer Science for Rhode Island? So CS4I was launched in 2016, and it's a partnership between state government, the Rhode Island Department of Ed, K-12 schools, higher ed institutions, private industry, and nonprofits, and the goal is to have all public schools teach computer science. This goal was met at some level in 2017, but the levels of how it was met varied. So while some courses actually had some schools had computer science courses, other schools were just involved in doing an hour of code. CS4I has program providers, and what they do is that they offer schools curriculum, resources, and professional development, which I will now refer to as PD. Why should we care? So 12.9% of all students in the US have some form of disability, and that percentage is even higher in the state of Rhode Island, with about 15% of all students having a documented disability. This varies wildly by district, with higher percentages close to about a quarter of our students in the urban core, so that's Central Falls, Pawtucket, Providence, and Woonsocket, having a documented disability. And you can see here in this chart, we have it by age, number of disabilities by age. So we have about over 21,000 students in our schools have disabilities, and a lot of times we forget to do research around how to make sure that our pedagogy and curriculum are inclusive to them. Something that inspires my work is this quote that I heard a couple years ago: if it doesn't work for everyone, it doesn't work. It's something that we all kind of know, but sometimes we forget. And something else that has inspired specifically my research around students with disabilities is freshman year of college, I ended up on crutches for about a week. I had never had to thought about making things accessible and having to be on campus. This campus is surprisingly inaccessible. Really made me start seeing how important accessibility is. Almost 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and so that now having a documented disability and having that identity really made me realize how forgotten people with disabilities are. So what did I want to do through my research? I wanted to answer these three questions. How accessible are program providers' curricula to students with disabilities? What are some recommendations for improving the accessibility of these curricula and the related professional development? And how can CS4I better support their educators, remove the access barriers, and encourage higher levels of engagement for students with disabilities? We want every student in the state to learn computer science. So how did I approach these questions? So I did a very thorough literature review because there's not a lot out there on computer science accessibility. I interviewed a couple of researchers whose focus is making computer science accessible. I sent out a survey to teachers who had participated in some sort of CS4I professional development, and I then followed up with teachers who had given me their email to do follow-up interviews based on their responses, and I also had access to rubrics that the program providers have filled out discussing how accessible they thought their curriculum and PDs were. So some of my findings, so like I said, there isn't a lot of research around computer science accessibility. Most of the research is actually coming out of University of Washington. They're phenomenal, but it's just one institution. There's a huge lack of representation. Not in the media, we don't really see disabled folks doing computing, and so people don't know that people with disabilities can do computing. There's a huge lack of information, not only about what computer science is, but again, because of the lack of representation, the idea that folks with disabilities can do computer science because there are things such as assistive technologies that allow them to work in these environments. Something that's really popular with computer science education now is block-based programming. And so I have here an example of a little block of code where the character or the sprite is going to move 10 steps, and then it'll say hello, and then it'll meow, and it's going to do that 10 times. So the idea of block-based programming is that because it's so visual and because you don't have to type things out, it's very accessible to a lot of learners, especially learners with learning disabilities and cognitive disabilities, and it's also accessible to younger folks. However, it's not accessible to students with physical disabilities. If you're visually impaired and you use a screen reader, screen readers cannot read these blocks of code. So basically, you think you have a blank screen. If you have reduced mobility or dexterity issues, it's a lot harder for you to take your mouse and drag all the blocks and make them click instead of just typing out the code. Universal design for learning is a great start, but it is not enough. And I do have one upside. Nevada did pass legislation that ensures that all students receive CS education, and they make it very explicit in their legislation to include, without limitation, students with disabilities. In the surveys, they were a little disheartening. So teachers, for the most part, do not feel that they have the knowledge, tools, or support to teach computer science in a way that it's accessible to students with disabilities. And furthermore, a lot of the tools and resources that they're using are not accessible. General findings around, from the interviews that I did with the teachers and the rubrics, there are many areas of improvement. For not just for addressing accessibility, but generally for making computer science better and better supporting educators. The teacher ingenuity is the main source of accessibility efforts. They come up with really great ways to make the curriculum accessible to their students with disabilities, but this isn't coming from the program providers and it's not coming from CS4I. They're just trying to figure it out on their own. There's a lack of awareness and resources for assistive technology, so a lot of teachers don't know if my student needs a specific keyboard, who do I go to get it? And then PDs failed to mention students with disabilities, accessibility, and universal design for learning. I have very specific recommendations that I crafted, and I created recommendations for program providers as well as for CS4I. But for the intents and purposes of this presentation, I just kind of categorize them into these broad buckets. Generally, we need to restructure and enhance professional development to address accessibility and universal design for learning. We need to make PD much more accessible. We need to do a better job of informing teachers and parents and students. And we need to collect data. We don't know if students with disabilities are even enrolling in these courses, and we don't know if they're not, why not. Like I mentioned before, there's a huge lack of data around computer science accessibility. So we currently, RIDE was not collecting data, or not doing a great job of collecting data around what CS courses were being offered in the schools. The survey data, I sent out the survey to about 600 teachers and only received about 40 responses, so the response rate wasn't too great. And then of the 40 teachers, I was only able to interview 4. So because of all of this, originally the idea was to actually do some data analysis, but there was no data to analyze, so I had to restructure the research. And halfway in, as I started investigating more universal design for learning and disabilities, I realized that the scope of the definition of disabilities was too broad for me. And so in drafting my recommendations, I really had to focus on what are the best practices for students with physical disabilities and what are the best practices for students with cognitive disabilities. Kind of related to the lack of research, This is an untapped and unprioritized research area. And so it's really difficult to reach out to people and ask, what are you doing and how can we make this better? Next steps, we want to create a teacher wiki so that they can have access to resources. I want to create in-depth recommendation handouts to address all the bullet points that I gave already to CS for RI and to go more in depth as to why those recommendations matter. We want to develop an accountability system for providers so that they can actually follow through on their recommendations and consider further research opportunities. And I think the most important part is that we have to keep the conversation going until it's a part of the culture and we stop forgetting to include all of our students. I'd like to acknowledge everyone who made this possible. Of course, the core team who's been super welcoming and super helpful just in every sense of the word. Hispanics in Computing listserv, they connected me with amazing people to start off my research. All the folks that I interviewed, the folks who kept me sane throughout the last 9 months, and then my co-panelists who gave me wonderful feedback to make this presentation better. And viewers like you. Thank you so much.